In this video, we are going to be going over continental shelves and the Neritic zone. And here are some important key concepts, but I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, and you can come back and review or pause as needed and check those out. But in general, when you start to move away from the land, the continental shelf will actually extend into the water. And that continental shelf tends to stay fairly shallow for a while, and then it will have a steep drop off called the continental slope. But that shelf, as it extends outward, this is all part of a continental plate, just like plate tectonics, and you have plate boundaries. This is all part of the piece of land that is supported by the continent itself. And then as it slopes downward, that tends to be the end. The continental slope tends to be the end of that edge, like that boundary of that piece of continental land. And then further, as it starts to plateau out here, is where it tends to meet the oceanic plate. So you'll have a continental plate meeting an oceanic plate. The oceanic plate will be a lot deeper and a lot denser, and the two tend to meet there. And sometimes you have some plate tectonics types of motion going on there, like earthquakes or volcanoes, etc. So this continental shelf is the part that is underneath the water and tends to be really shallow before it gets to the continental slope. And just above that is the water, just above the continental shelf before it goes down the slope. And that water area is called the Neritic Zone. So the Neritic Zone is the area of water above the continental shelf, and then there is the continental shelf. And in different spaces, these are different lengths. For instance, on the west coast, you can have it as short as the continental shelf, be as short as a mile. But actually, in Southern California, ours is only just over half a mile. It's pretty short. And then it can be really long in some places and really gradual, how slowly it goes out into the water, up to 800, 900 miles in parts of Siberia. So this is the gradual descent, and there's a lot of sunlight and nutrients in this Neritic zone that makes it really a productive place and a productive ecosystem. So how much the waves and the currents in the area are acting will cause a large variety in the number of organisms that live there. If you have a space that it does not have that much wave action, it's a lot more calm, you're going to have a lot more organisms that live there. But if you have a really active like wave action and really strong currents in that space, then down below you tend to not have a lot of life and organisms just because of how volatile the water system there is. But if you have a water space that is like as calm as this one, that is causing these tiny little ripples to accumulate in the sand, you can have a lot of nutrients. And you can see here these darker spaces in between the white, like lighter colored, light tan areas. That will be a lot of nutrients that are there that the sand holds for different organisms to eat. So this water flow in these spaces will not only move the organisms, but it moves their gametes, like their sex cells, and also will move their food around. So in areas where you have different shear stress, so you might have a place where the water is moving really quickly, so it's got a lot more nutrients in it, and it's got a lot more oxygen in it because it's quickly flowing around. It In a lot of ways that's good because it's having a fast flow of water, and you're getting those extra nutrients and the extra oxygen, but the water is moving really quickly, and so it might be harder to anchor yourself or stay in one place. Whereas a slow moving area, you might not get as much oxygen or food, but it is easier to stay in one place. So different organisms are going to be able to inhabit these different spaces. Algae that lives there, benthic algae particularly, can grow really, really deep in the ocean, but because it photosynthesizes, it can only go as deep as the water is still clear and the sun can still reach. So if it can't get sun past a certain point because say the water is really turbid or really like cloudy, then the algae stops growing. So as long as you can get light down to a space on some of these, you can have good algae growth. So plumes specifically, and it was hard to find a good picture of this, of what it looks like in motion, but imagine this is a river coming into the ocean water and dropping off a lot of its like sediment and debris as it comes down. It's going to make this really cloudy water called a plume. It brings a lot of nutrients, but it also can choke some organisms out, make it hard to photosynthesize, etc. So, depending on the type of sediment that is in an area, you'll have different organisms live there. So, some organisms will want a rocky bottom so they can hold on and stay in that place or hide in between the rocks. Some will prefer sand. So, there's something called epifauna, which are animals and organisms that live on the surface of the sediment. So, think about like sponges, cnidarians, anemones, things that don't really want to move and they'll just stay in the same place. Then you can have infauna, which is like this clam that will actually dig into the sediment, like clams or worms or snails that will want to stay in that space. Then it's hard to picture because they're so tiny. And so I put the picture of the copepod here, but a copepod, for instance, or some other plankton can be so small that they don't have to burrow in between the sand. They can literally, if the sand is coarse enough, they actually fit in between the sand particles. So that would be called an interstitial type of animal. And of course, like the backbone to these benthic communities is dead and decaying matter that is falling down or things that die on the bottom and deteriorate, and also the plankton that are photosynthesizing and forming the basis of the whole food chain. It's very important. So there's hard bottom communities, and on hard bottom communities, you'll have some sessile organisms. Again, they don't want to move, like soft coral, and you'll also have some epibenthic organisms. These are things like, say, a fish that wants to live really close to the sand, but is not anchored to the sand. It just tends to live really close to the sand just above it. So these areas can be very patchy, where you'll have, let me show you on the next slide, some coarser sediment and some finer sediment, and different things will live in different spots. So on coarser sediments, you might have anemones or sponges, whereas in the finer sediments, you might have worms and things like different bivalves that will burrow into the sand, and they will get different nutrients from different spaces. A very important, very, very important community that lives in the Neritic Zone are kelp communities. These are like underwater giant forests. One type of giant kelp is called a macrocystis, and then I wanted to show you this one called a sea palm, and this is a type of kelp called Icenia, and these are different types of kelp. There's other versions that create these whole forests, and they create different layers and levels under the water where different organisms can live in safety, relative safety, at different depths. And the kelp can be really far distance, like in this little GIF up here. The kelp is not very close, to where it can be really thick to swim through. One of the organisms that lives in Southern California that I just really like is the giant sea bass. It reminds me of almost like this massive goldfish that's completely black, but it acts like a goldfish just sitting there staring at you, and you never know when you're going to come around a blade of like the kelp forest, and one's just going to be sitting there looking at you, and they can be 7 feet long and 700 pounds. It's really cool. So kelp actually release spores when they want to germinate, and they can grow really, really quickly, like 10 to 16 and a half feet a week. They have these flattened blades for photosynthesizing. Then they can also live for somewhere around 6 months to a couple of years, depending on the species, like 3 to 7 years. So they have these different parts. The bottom is called the holdfast, which is almost like if it was a regular plant, it's an algae, but if it was a plant, you could almost think of that as the root system that's holding on in the stipe, like the trunk of a tree. The gas bladders are like these little balloons of air that help float the whole blade upward. And if these ever wash up onto the beach, it's fun to pop those. They make a like they're full of air. And then you have the blades, which are like the leaves that will photosynthesize. And these are so important to our ocean communities because they provide food and shelter. They help buffer the ocean and slow down the waves and slow down the currents that are going in and out. All types of organisms live there: urchins and stars, and like in Southern California, sheephead and rockfish and Garibaldi and wrasse. They all live in this cool forest and create more habitat for other organisms. Unfortunately, our kelp is really threatened by certain organisms like these purple sea urchins. When a long time ago, people made the decision to go and kill a lot of our sea otters, and they did that for the fur trade, and it was really destructive to our kelp forests indirectly. I don't think they knew that would happen, but it really hurt our kelp forests because these sea otters will go and eat tons and tons of urchins, and the spines don't seem to bother them at all. And they'll crack open the urchins on a calloused area of their chest, and they'll use like rocks or whatever, and they'll pound it open and they'll just eat it like sushi inside. And they throw out the shell, and then they'll go get more and more urchins. The problem has been, since there are less predators on the urchins, you can have some areas like this where the kelp holdfasts are literally just being devoured by tons and tons of urchins, and the urchins are completely out of control. They'll eat off the holdfast, and the whole blade, because of those air bladders, will just float to the top because there's no holdfast, and then it will die off, and you'll see large masses of these on the beach that are killed for different reasons, but sometimes because of urchins. And it's really unfortunate because it wrecks our whole forest, underwater forest there. Another thing is these kelp gribbles, which mine holes through the holdfast a lot like termites do. Here's a video from BBC Earth called "The Army of Sea Urchins," which shows the urchins eating them. But if there's an organism that you want to fish, especially in Southern California, it's very helpful to fish these purple urchins because they are like a pest. On these rock bottoms, you can also have lots of different microhabitats, and a lot of organisms on the steeper parts of these rocky bottoms will be sessile organisms that will filter feed on off of the overhang in the ocean water that is passing by. And then you have different animals that live in different crevices for protection. I put an octopus here because if you hunt around, you usually can find a few different octopi that are there that you can see. So in benthic communities, you will have some that are sandy and some that are muddy. If there's really strong currents, it tends to be more like sand. And if the water's moving really slowly, slower, weaker currents, it'll tend to be more muddy. Here's a muddy bottom organism for you, which I put here. This is a burrowing sea cucumber, and what they look like here above here, this is just a drawing of how they live, but this is what they look like if you find one. So a burrowing sea cucumber will actually have its mouth down at the bottom and kind of pull sediment through its body that it filters, and then it will expel those through its anus, its fecal material, but then other organisms will go and live in this space. So it creates these little environments for other organisms. When there has been a large disturbance in a space, say you have a human disturbance where someone pulls a boat all the way through this space and it just like literally kills everything that's there and just grinds through the bottom of the space, or say you have an underwater landslide or there's sudden erosion that happens underneath the water, things can eventually grow back. Sometimes some anoxic sediments will be exposed. These are sediments that have low amounts of oxygen because so much decomposition has happened there. But eventually, some like small larvae will tend to be brought there by the water and start to colonize, and larger organisms can start aerating the water again and getting more nutrients can cycle through, and the area can be restored over time in something called succession. So it's really hard to get a lot of pictures of this because most of the time they don't know when one of these events is going to take place. But I did want to show you this picture because it has to do with the urchins and how depleted things can get. This is actually a series of pictures over here on the left that kind of show if you have really good kelp forests, sometimes you'll actually see it floating above the water. And then underneath, you can see the kelp holding on and what it would look like underneath the water. Or in this space, you can't see the kelp above the water. And this happens to actually be a picture of the same area. Underneath the water, the kelp is really dead. And in a lot of ways, it's because of these urchins that you see all over the place. And this stripe, it's hard to see, but this darker purple stripe here is a bunch of urchins that have eaten away almost everything there. And they're starving and they're going to go and eat something else. So the Neritic zone, the basis of these food chains is really the bacteria that break down dead and decaying matter. But from there, you'll have these microphytoplankton, very small plant plankton, and they will actually photosynthesize and grow and use nutrients from freshwater runoff. And what eats those tiny plant plankton is the zooplankton. The animal plankton will feed on them, and then larger fish will eat them, and even larger fish. You can see that this is a pretty basic food chain because we don't really go out that deep in the Neritic zone. So really large animals tend to not live there. So this is what the food pyramid or the energy pyramid looks like in this part of the ocean. Specifically, areas that have upwelling, meaning the deep sea currents come and bring a bunch of nutrients up from the bottom and put those nutrients up closer to the surface. Those spaces like Southern California, Peru, they have a lot of upwelling in those spaces. That will account for about half of the world's supply of commercial fish. So it's a very important process that happens that helps these areas. So I want to point out on this energy pyramid that primary producers, the phytoplankton, are really small compared to the consumers. And you never see that, hardly ever. I can't ever remember seeing that in another space. But here, these primary producers here, these plant plankton, they can be a lot smaller in number because they breed so quickly and then get to their full, like adult, like full size, and then they're eaten, but they have bred before they're eaten, and they breed again and replicate so quickly that they are actually smaller in number. They're just turned over very rapidly. Additionally, not on this energy pyramid is all of the dead and decaying matter that a lot of times these primary consumers will go straight towards the detritus and eat that directly. In the Neritic zone, you'll also have a lot of plankton that is only temporarily plankton. So I put like crab, shrimp, lobster. These are all organisms that are only plankton for a little bit before they switch and grow into another phase. And these planktonic larvae, I want to point out that with sessile organisms, say you have something like an anemone, it doesn't want its babies to necessarily be right next to it. So having wave action that takes its plankton babies to another space and drops them off somewhere not directly next to the parent where they're going to have to compete really serves a large purpose in their reproductive cycle. So it's thought, but this number is just a best guess, that only about 1 in every 100,000 plankton will survive to adulthood, or larvae will survive into adulthood. And the health of plankton in general is really, really important for the entire ecosystem. So I have two videos here. One's from the BBC Earth, Why Are Plankton the Most Vital Organisms on Earth? And another video by TED-Ed, The Secret Life of Plankton, where you can learn a little bit more. So that is the end of our video for continental shelves and the Neritic Zone.